Okay, good afternoon, raging bulls and Hindu cows. My name's Danny. This is My Own Worst Enemy mental health podcast. Okay, I'm going to try and keep this intro to under 10 minutes this week. So, last week's episode, if you haven't heard it already, I interviewed self-confessed paedophile and pro-paedophilia advocate Tom O'Carroll. And just because there were so many potential accusations and misunderstandings that could have arisen from doing an episode of that nature, the introduction alone wound up running to something like 40 minutes in length before we even got to the interview itself. It's just basically me trying to think of all the potential controversies that might arise out of it and then trying to explain them away. And I've got to be honest, fell flat because it still ended up pissing a load of people off anyway, so I probably shouldn't have even bothered. But anyway, I can't be arsed this week. I'm sort of getting sick of the sound of my own voice to be going on too long. The other reason I'm going to have to keep it short is I haven't actually got much choice. Okay, so you know I like to try and lead into these episodes by sharing a little anecdote that somehow opposite to whatever the topic of the day is. Well, today we're talking about anger. And I've sort of sat there before, going through all the occasions when I've sort of been pissed off about something enough that it's driven me to act on it. And what I've discovered is there's no way to tell an anger-based anecdote that doesn't just make you sound like a bit of a wanker, basically. It's like anger anecdotes aren't really anecdotes. Like, they're not funny. They're more just like confessions about this one time where you acted like a bit of a wanker. So, for instance, the time I put my foot through the screen of our family TV and then, not satisfied with this, proceeded to smash it to pieces with a baseball bat. Yeah, there's a context to that incident. Yeah, there's a reason I went postal on the TV, which, even in retrospect, thinking about it now years later, feels somewhat justified, and it sort of makes me chuckle a little bit. But it doesn't translate very well. Yeah, it's not just one of those like you had to be there moments, but you actually had to be me in order to see the humour in it. I've got another where found out my ex-girlfriend was cheating on me. I drove round to her house at like 2 a.m. and then smashed her fancy pieces car to bits with a hammer and then poured paint all over it. But even in that scenario, where I'm the one getting mugged off, that story still makes me sound like the bad guy, like I'm the one being unreasonable. So the best anger story I've managed to come up with, and I'm not even sure it counts really because it's such a tenuous link, but it'll have to do, I'm afraid. And I'm only insisting on telling it because I'm not comfortable with closing out this introduction, leaving you with the image of me smashing a car to pieces with a hammer, like some sort of automotive version of Kathy Bates in Misery. Okay, so here goes. So yeah, back when the Black Album came out by Jay-Z, so what's that, something like 2003 or something, so I'd have been like 21 or whatever. Anyway, obsessed with Jay-Z. I'm listening to this album obsessively, and just Jay-Z in general, to be honest. But this album, I was on it. I was just walking around pretty much every waking hour with my headphones in, listening to this album. Anyway, one day my mum says, she's cooking in the kitchen, and she says, "Right, come on." She says, "Let's have a listen to this album you keep banging on about." So I gave her the CD. Shows you how far back it was. And she's listening to it in the kitchen while she's doing her cooking, and I sort of go away for like half an hour or whatever and leave her to it. Come back after a while. She's about halfway through the album, and I say, "So, Mum, what do you think of the album?" And she says, "I'm not sure if I like it, to be honest." So I said, "Okay, why not?" And she says, "Well, he just sounds angry." I said, "He's not angry." She says, "Well, he bleeding sounds like it because he keeps calling me a bitch, and he's told me to suck his dick about 6 times already." And she said, "I'm not sure if I want to." So, still in there with a chance, Jay-Z. So there you go. It made me chuckle at the time, and like I say, that's the nearest I can come to an anger anecdote that doesn't make me sound like a danger to my own children, so it'll have to do. Anyway, my guest today is Greg Sadler. Greg is a philosopher, academic entrepreneur, and writer. He is the president and co-founder of ReasonIO, where the goal is to take difficult philosophical texts and thinkers and make them accessible to non-philosophers, as well as providing philosophical workshops, consulting and counselling services to organisations, students and members of the public. Greg's YouTube channel boasts almost 50,000 subscribers and more than 4.7 million video views, and with more than 1,300 videos on everything from existentialism to utilitarianism, and lectures on the teachings of philosophers as diverse as the ancient Greeks, like Plato and Aristotle, right the way up to modern thinkers such as Martin Heidegger and Albert Camus, or Albert Camus as we call him in Manchester. Greg is also the editor of Stoicism Today, which is the official blog for the Modern Stoicism organisation, and the producer of the half-hour Hegel series. Now, I have to say, love me some philosophy, and I'll read any old shite, yeah? However, there's 3 philosophers I could just never get into. Martin Heidegger, Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and Hegel. Kant as well. Kant is a bit of a cant to read as well. So yeah, reading them idiots is about as accessible as reading Swahili and Braille in a mirror, a dirty mirror, upside down, whilst pissed on absinthe, yeah? But I've got to say, I've just actually watched a couple of these half-hour Hegel videos of Greg's, and they're actually pretty good. Put it this way, I no longer want to wipe my ass on the phenomenology of spirit, which is major progress, because back in my loopy lefty days, me and all my little communist comrades used to engage in this sort of communal lie that we'd all read Hegel. So we all had this thorough understanding of the Hegelian underpinnings of Marxian philosophy, which was bollocks because I'd never read him and neither had they. We'd tried, but like I say, it's like reading hieroglyphics. So it used to sort of stress me out this. I was always sort of worried that one day I'd bump into someone who'd actually read Hegel and they'd call me out for being a little bullshitter. But there's the trick, yeah? Nobody ever has read Hegel except Greg, right? So I might actually have a crack at going through the full series now. If anything, just so I can sort of show off next time I'm at the barber's. So like when the barber asks me, what do you do at the weekend or whatever, I can be like, nothing much, just studying a bit of Hegel. And then when he says, what the hell are you talking about? I can say, because everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject. I fade on a number 1 sunshine and chop chop so I can go get back to studying me Hegel. Not quite sure that's what Greg had in mind in wanting to sort of make philosophy accessible to the layperson, but, we've all got to get our kicks somewhere or other, I suppose. Anyway, in today's episode, we explore the various causes and manifestations of anger, the difference between chronic and acute anger, the relationship between anger and vengeance, why some people's anger becomes directed inwards towards the self, whereas other people's anger is directed towards other people and the outside world, why anger can sometimes be a productive or even an enjoyable experience, and we close up by turning to Stoic philosophy for some tips and advice on how to avoid hitting the roof when you're absolutely fucking steaming. Right, now we've got the inappropriate and potentially misleading preface and generalities out of the way, time to crack on and delve into the full range of particulars that exist within the rubric of the universal. Little Hegelian in-joke there. See, Greg, I was listening. You can follow Greg on Twitter. He's at philosopher70. That's at philosopher70. You can visit Greg's website, which is reasonio.wordpress.com. That's reasonio.wordpress.com. As always, for the show notes, just go to myownworstenemy.org. And, as I always say, if you're enjoying this podcast, you'd like to help support it, and in the process, gain access to my monthly AMA or Ask Me Anything episodes, just go to myownworstenemy.org/support and subscribe for as little as £2 a month. So, that's about it. In the meantime, please feel free to go absolutely apeshit, and as always, please enjoy my conversation with Greg Sadler. Right, okay. Greg Sadler, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Okay. Okay, today we are talking about anger. I kind of feel like this is a bit of a specialist subject of mine.
Because you struggle with it? I mean, that's how I got into studying anger myself. Is that why?
Not so much that I struggle with it. I sort of indulge in it to an extent. We're jumping straight in here. Let's get on with it. So I found that strangely, so everybody, any sort of regular listeners will know my thing is struggling with that anxiety and agoraphobia, and always sort of stuck in my head. And I got the strange experience of finding that anger, when I'm angry, it's one of the not anymore, but at the time when I was sort of in the thick of it, anger was my only solace from being sort of stuck in my head all the time. There was this sort of like a single sort of bloody mindedness about it that the rest of the world, whatever it is, completely falls away.
Yeah.
All the anxiety, everything you're worried about, and you just fucking pissed off.
Yeah.
and and I get, for some people that's going to be a bad thing, but for me it was an it was an indulgence. I mean, that's not quite the right word, but I didn't I didn't feel bad about getting in those places, and the way I maybe treated people sometimes due to being angry, I'd sort of it it was I'd let myself off the hook because of that,
Yeah.
because it felt good. Do you know what I mean? And it was sort of it was therapeutic in a way. It's not just in the moment when I'm sort of raging angry. It was sort of afterwards as well. It was sort of a bit like an orgasm, if you like, where you sort of blissful afterwards. You like that, they say talk about blowing off steam, and it
Yeah.
very much
Yeah.
sort of felt like that. The weight of the world being lifted off your shoulders, that kind of thing. So yeah. What's so this is the case for you as well?
Well, no, it sounds to me like you're at one end of the spectrum when it comes to anger. And I've my whole life been at the other end where I get too angry. It's caused a lot of problems for me. I needed to sort of, to be less angry. But to talk about one of the things that you brought up, anger as an emotion is a very active emotion compared to some of the other things that we feel. Like you talked about anxiety, right? With anxiety, you're not quite sure, what to do. It can be paralyzing at times. Sadness is like that. Pain is like that. They're much more. They're not passive emotions in the sense that you're not uh, doing anything, but they place you in a passive position with respect to whatever it is that you're feeling sad or anxious about. When you're angry, you get to do something, and that actually does feel good. And that's why for people like me at the other end, it can become addictive because instead of feeling anxiety or fear or instead of feeling pain or sadness or whatever else, envy or something like that, you get to feel this other thing that at least for a moment, sometimes for quite a while, has you very focused on doing things or saying things, and that feels better, even if it feels bad. It still feels better than what you'd be going through. And I think, in some people's case, they don't get angry when it would be advantageous for them to get angry. And then, if they stuff it down or they repress it or turn it into something else, after a while, it can actually feel very good to admit it. And we'll talk about some different theories and approaches to anger. One of the ones that I work with a lot is Stoicism, and Stoics think that anger is uniformly bad. So Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, never good to get angry. Um, and they oppose themselves to the Aristotelians, who are more like, well, you should get angry at the right time for the right reason to the right extent. And it sounds like you were sometimes on the low end of that, and I was on the high end of that. Um, but I think that even a Stoic could say it's not good to get angry sometimes, but it could be better than feeling other emotions that are crippling, and so it's you could say it's not good, but it's less bad. Aristotle would actually go to the other side and say sometimes it's actually good to be angry. If I see my kid getting bullied and that can spur me to do something about it, then it's okay to get angry. it's just we have to be very careful with it because it can easily spill over onto other people, and we can get angry about all sorts of other things, and then it can become a habit where, like in my case as a kid, I learned, and I'm not sure exactly how I learned this, but I learned that if I got angry with people, I could get what I wanted out of situations. And that was a terrible lesson for me to learn because then, it became a kind of crutch that I'd use over and over again. There's lots of people out there like me too. So, um, once you become dependent on something like that, you don't develop the other skills that you need. And so then, you have to work your way out of the anger, but you also have to develop the other parts of yourself that you've left less developed. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, well, we sort of touched upon quite a few of the things that I've sort of written down that I want to cover there. But I think what we should do is sort of take a step back
Okay.
and sort of introduce you to the listeners, because I think so far they just know you as angry guy. I've invited a
Yeah.
guy who's angry onto the podcast, and it's like,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
no, there's more to it than that. So, if you could, Greg, sort of think about it like imagine, give us the sort of the sort of 3 minute speed dating version of who you are, what you do,
Okay.
those sort of things.
Yeah. So I used to be a full time professor, an academic philosopher, doing the typical sort of thing with teaching and research. And in the last 10 years, I've moved, I still do a little bit of teaching, but I moved much more into doing philosophy in practical and public ways. So I do quite a bit of coaching. I do a lot of tutorials. I've got the YouTube channel, which, as we are talking about, has about 50,000 subscribers. Um, I'm the editor of Stoicism Today, and I do workshops and clinics and things like that for mostly for corporate clients, but also for other settings as well. And the main thing that I do is take resources from philosophy, from mostly from ancient and medieval and early modern philosophy, and adapt them for non-academics to use. So, when it comes to anger, let me talk about that real quick. So I had the interest in, anger because I wanted to figure out why am I so screwed up. And then I found that in classic philosophy, there were all these great discussions and theories and techniques that had to do with anger, and that they were sometimes much more insightful than the current psychologists were, depending on which school of psychology you're coming from. And, I thought you could have kind of a useful synthesis of these. So I do quite a bit of work on anger management specifically with clients and organizations.
Okay, so well, a couple of things there. So the first thing I'm interested in is I always ask this question to everybody: why philosophy? Why did you
Mm.
study philosophy? I always sort of feel that philosophy is sort of it's sort of the realm for sort of introspective people, and I think there's also some sort of correlation as well between being introspective and well being neurotic and being sort of susceptible to mental health issues. Um, is that the case? Is that the case for you on both those fronts? So what was the interest in philosophy? Any sort of are you sort of prone to introspection, and
Yeah.
what are the consequences of that?
I mean, I think you're right that there are a lot of people who get drawn into philosophy through introspection because, there's this like theme at the beginning, know thyself, right? It's actually a Delphic maxim that Socrates then introduces into philosophy. So that's a big part of it. There's plenty of people who like have no self-awareness whatsoever in academic philosophy, though, I can tell you that. Um, you might be a little disappointed with some of them if you take classes. In my case, you know, uh, my story is kind of a comedy of errors. Um, I didn't really intend to. I never intended to become a college professor. As a matter of fact, when I was in high school, I didn't even plan to go to college. I didn't take any of the exams that you were supposed to. I was going into the army, and I thought I would be like a lifer or get out and become a mercenary of all things, which is rather silly, but makes sense for a kid who's got anger problems. And then I got in the army, and they made me take college tests, and then I actually started to read some philosophy stuff, but it wasn't in any systematic way. And we'd get into these arguments about things, you know. And I always did like to knock ideas around and try to argue about them. And so then when I got out and I was working in a restaurant, you know, and deciding to finally go to college, my mom had a boyfriend who said, when you get to college, declare a major right away. That way you won't just, you know, be a face in the crowd. You'll be somebody who's affiliated with, you know, this program. So I looked down the list and I saw philosophy. And I said, that sounds cool. I'll do that. And so I
But
just
what
started.
that's it, Greg. So, but why did it sound cool?
Well, you know, I'd had a few um, introductions to philosophy through other things I was reading, like in history. You know, I was very interested in classical history at the time, and they mentioned philosophy. And then when I was in high school, I took a philosophy class because I went to a Catholic high school, and the philosophy class was terrible. Um, and then I took another class where we studied a bit of philosophy because the teacher was supposed to teach us about sacraments, and so he said, "I'll teach you about Augustine, and if I'm going to teach you Augustine, I need to teach you some Plato and Aristotle first." And he would just go to the board and he'd write, and then he'd have us discuss things. So the other students hated it. There was no textbook, you know, it was all discussion. They wanted to know what's going to be on the test, and he wouldn't tell them. But I really enjoyed it. And so that, you know, that gave me some anchor points. I still didn't have much of an idea of what was, you know, in the field of philosophy, but it gave me an anchor point so that when I saw that, I was like, yeah, that sounds cool. I'll do that. And then I just started taking classes, and the classes, some of them weren't very good and some of them were quite interesting. But the school that I went to had a policy of benign neglect, and so they just sort of let me, you know, do what I wanted to do. And I would go to the library and, you know, read what I wanted to read. And they, so long as I was making good progress, they didn't bother me. And then I finished. You know? And so then I didn't go to graduate school right away. I worked here in Milwaukee, actually just a few blocks from where we're living right now, in a big high rise um, third shift security guard, which let me have a lot of time for reading and working on languages. And so I was, you know, reading some philosophy texts, and then I decided to go to graduate school. And I didn't do any more planning with that. I just sort of, you know, picked a bunch of places to apply to, and I took the one that gave me some money to go there, not knowing that that wouldn't be a great job move. But you know, I mean, who knows these sorts of things, right? I didn't come from an academic family, so then I got there, and it was a really wonderful place to study, Southern Illinois, at Carbondale. Um, they had an amazing research library. You know, there were a lot of good professors representing different schools. And if I wanted to do my Greek stuff, I could do it with the classics department. Um, and so I did the same sort of thing where I just, you know, a lot of the study I did on my own. Um, and you know, I could have done so many other things and probably been, you know, happy eventually in them, but I just kind of went that way rather than thinking it out. I mean, it's kind of unphilosophical, right? I should have like done a pros and cons list and, you know, uh, been very rational about it, but I just kind of followed my inclinations. Um, and I was fortunate to be in places that allowed me to do that. I think a lot of places I could have gone to, they really would have stifled me instead, and I wouldn't have stuck with it.
So you've mentioned this sort of the anger issues,
Mm.
and that sounds like that preceded this foray
Oh
into
yeah,
education and philosophy.
yeah.
So do you mind talking about that, taking us to the genesis of this, and maybe when it became a problem, and why it maybe arose in the first place?
Yeah. I think that there are I don't buy necessarily into a classic theory of temperaments where we would, you know, associate them with, you know, four different humors or anything like that. But I do think that human beings, some of us are bent more in one direction than another. Some of us are more jovial by nature. Some of us are more irritable by nature. And I think I'm one of those people. And then, you know, like I said, I learned early on as a strategy as a male kid growing up here in the Midwest in the 70s and 80s, that anger could work for me and sometimes get me what I want. So that was a bad lesson to learn. And then I struggled with quite a few things that would make you angry anyway. My dad died when I was 11. Um, very young. He was only 36. Very hard worker. Got sick. They never figured out what he actually died of. And you had to deal with the normal stuff, and I didn't take things very well. And then I would be encouraged to do the blowing off steam, right? My We had a forest out back, and I had an axe. So when I'd get angry, I'd go and chop a tree down. And what I didn't realize is I wasn't actually blowing off steam. I was really more just reinforcing the habit of getting angry, doing something, and then remaining angry about it. So there was that sort of stuff, and it got me in a lot of trouble. I at one time I was actually a ward of the court because my mother had filed what was called an uncontrollability petition against me. I had to seek counseling for it. It got in the way of a lot of friendships later on, and some relationships. So it's probably the thing that I've struggled with the most in my life, I would say.
When you were saying about like it sometimes it 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 was reinforced because you sort of it got you things, you got your way
Yeah.
in certain situations. Have you got any sort of examples of where that sort of that secondary payoff came from?
Oh, yeah. I
Like what
mean,
you know? I mean, do you think was it a conscious thing that you knew that if I know that if I get angry in this situation, that it'll that I'll get the outcome that I want, or is that only in retrospect that you've realised that that was the
yeah, it's
case?
more in retrospect. I mean, I can see how we can talk about sort of conscious thought, right? And then sort of unconscious thought processes, where we're engaging in some practical reasoning that we can reconstruct later. And I think that there was quite a bit of that where young Greg realized that by blowing up at people and being very aggressive, that I could get what I wanted. As a matter of fact, when I was in graduate school, I would argue with people so vociferously that I actually um, sort of just beat people down linguistically. And I think a lot of that was driven by anger and a sort of contentiousness. Some people thought it was kind of funny or cool, and looking back on it, it was really kind of a jerk,
Mm.
frankly. As a matter of fact, too, that also happened. My first teaching job, full time teaching, was in a maximum security prison. And I actually just wrote about this on Quora today. I published a piece about how I blew up at a student my first week of class. He had rightly pointed out, as sort of a spokesperson for the class, that I had assigned way too much reading. And I took him as challenging me in class, and we got into a shouting match, and eventually I kicked him out of class. So I'm kicking out a guy in a room full of inmates, many of whom are murderers. He was actually a kidnapper, um, but I didn't know that he wasn't a murderer. Big tattooed guy, and I'm a big guy myself, so we were sort of like face to face with each other, and I told him to get the hell out of my classroom, and he did, even though he didn't have to. And part of what I wrote about is he behaved as a more mature person than I did, and I was the professor, you know so I really should have behaved in a much better way. And we the education supervisor insisted that we like have a conference and talk and work things out, and we did. And eventually, we actually became friends. But part of the damage was done because the students realized that I could get ticked off easily, and some of them thought it was funny. So they would try to get either themselves get my goat, or better yet, get somebody else to do it by saying, "Oh, this is too much reading," or "I don't want to do this work," or something like that. And I would blow up at these guys, which is really stupid. I mean, if there's any environment where that would be a bad thing to do, um, presumably a maximum security prison would be one of them. And so, that was one of the signs too. When I realized that they were actually talking about how like my ears would turn red and things like that, I realized, wow, I really need to get control over this, because these guys are, getting a kick out of it. So, yeah.
Okay, so well, this sort of brings me to one of the fundamental questions I've got,
Mm,
and it's that. So I'm wondering what it is for you, the kind of things that piss you off, basically.
oh,
For me, it's so I did when I was doing a bit of research for this interview. I did an anger test online.
okay.
I don't know how accurate it is. And there was one on BuzzFeed and stuff like that. I didn't do that one, but it could be just some arbitrary list put together by any old idiot. But it was on a psychology website, so it must be legit. Um, and so I got an anger rating of 45%, which I was surprised by, to be honest. But what was interesting to me was the the nature of the questions, where so it was rating your answers on like a scale of 1 to 5, like
Okay.
one being it doesn't bother me at all, 5 being I want to smash the world to pieces.
Yeah.
And all the questions where I was answering a 5 were they were financial and money related questions.
Oh,
Yeah, and like
interesting.
if I feel that somebody's trying to con me, or if someone's overcharging me or something
Yeah.
like that. And I found that interesting because well, a couple of reasons. So more recently, about oh god, my regular listeners are going to be like, oh, for fuck's sake, not this again. So I've been moaning a lot recently. So about 2 months ago, my car broke down, and then I had to buy a new one because we were going on holiday. And then the next day, that broke down on the way
Oh,
to the holiday, and it
yeah.
broke down completely. And so it was like all that money down the drain, and I had to tow it back to Manchester, which was like a few hundred £100, and we missed out on the holiday and all sorts, and I had to hire a car
Yeah.
and but it really, I mean, it really, Greg, it really fucking pissed me off. And it's been pissing me off for the past 2 months because every interaction I've had with trying to buy a car off someone, I've just got the attitude of you're trying to have my eyes out. From the moment I walk on the car lot, I've got me I've got my back up,
Yeah.
and I'm not really a sort of I'm not really that sort of person, and I was never never like aggressive. I'm not big enough to be aggressive with people, but it brings out a very snarky, sarcastic, demeaning side. I'll try
Yeah.
and find people's weaknesses just in conversation, um, just to have little digs at them, little backhanded things like I've said something offhand, and I know I've said it, but it's not overt enough that you can say anything about it. Passive
Yeah.
aggressive, I guess.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that very recently that side's come out with me, and it's taken me 2 bleeding months to buy a car because I'm just so het up about it. But also, all my sort of the genesis of my mental health issues, that when it sort of spiraled out of control, were after going bankrupt. I had a
Mm,
business and went bankrupt. I've been obsessed with money ever since, and anything to do with it, any bill that falls through the door, someone's trying to have my eyes out, and it
yeah.
just it's like that. Um, but I'm curious what your thing is, what it tends to be. But then I'm guessing if you can sort of extrapolate it, I'm guessing at a philosophical level, there's going to be something more fundamental underlying whatever the surface issue is. So I'll
Yeah,
hand that over
right
to you.
there. Well, I don't have a one single thing, and that's part of the problem is I can get angry about all sorts of different things. So, something I've been actually working on a lot is traveling in traffic. Um, it's really easy to get there's so many opportunities for things to go wrong when you're a workday commute, or you have to fly somewhere. And I've been using techniques from Stoics and Aristotle and Platonists to try to work on those things, and it is helping. I also get quite upset about some things in politics. Um, Especially here in the United States, we have two parties, neither of whom are particularly good, um, and some of the things they do are really quite upsetting. I get angry at students sometimes. I mentioned I still teach classes, and the sense of entitlement that some students have, emailing you at midnight and expecting that they should get a reply about their particular issue, when they haven't been good students. That kind of gets to me. Um, there's personal things. If I think that somebody is disrespecting me, and I think that kind of goes to the car salesman thing that you're talking about, that feeling that you're being in some way disrespected, right?
Mm,
um, and I get in arguments over stupid things that then can escalate to larger things. It has gotten quite a bit better over the years, but I'm still nowhere near where I'd like to be. I get angry at my kids sometimes, when they're misbehaving. Um, I know one thing too is that if I'm in a situation where time is a factor and it's very compressed, um, then I'm in a situation where it's easier for me to get angry. Or if I'm hungry, because I haven't been attending to needing to eat 3 meals a day. Or if I'm sick, I really have to watch. Smaller things can set me off. And so, once you know those sorts of things, you can actually do something about it. You make sure that your blood sugar doesn't get too low, in my case, or that you actually get enough sleep, or if you haven't done that, you tell yourself, "Oh, I've got to really watch it here because this is where I have a tendency to go off the handle." So, there's no one single sphere of life. I can get angry about just about anything if you give me a chance. But you're right, there's a common thread to that. So Aristotle says that we get angry when he uses the word slighting, oligoria, making less of in Greek. When somebody, and he uses the word apparent too. So because we can be totally mistaken about this. Like if I show up late to our conversation, you could be like, "Oh, that jerk Greg," and maybe I got caught in traffic or something like that. I didn't have any control over it, but you perceive it that way. So when I perceive somebody as slighting me in some way, showing contempt, um, being spiteful to me, just getting in the way, deliberately trying to hurt me in some way, or injure or humiliate me. Or Aristotle says, anybody else that you care about or anything else that you care about, then we get angry. And when we do get angry, anger is a desire not just to hurt the other person, it's a desire to impose a kind of justice. We want to set things right. You know, we feel like the other person has wronged us, and by doing something to them, that's going to balance things out. So if you're snarky with the car salesman, it's because on some level he deserves that. That's what you feel, right? Now he
mm,
may not, right? And in cases like that, and I have plenty of cases that I can relate to too, where somebody else has made us angry, and then we take it out on a different person who resembles them in some way. Because you could walk onto a car lot and somebody could be the one truly fair used car salesman, and you don't know that. So you treat him like he's just one of the other car salesmen, and you're already angry to some degree over the predicament you're in, and so you behave in that way towards him. Similarly, if a student needs help with something and they're legitimately, emailing me in a rush because their life is such a mess, if I treat them like the other students who I got angry at, then I'm going to transfer that earlier anger onto them. And one of the things that I do to help myself with students is I remind myself what a pain in the ass I was as a student to my professors. When I was a younger person, and I would raise all sorts of what I thought were clever questions, but on retrospect, really kind of off base or stupid questions, or bother them about format, or want to pigeonhole them after class and talk their ear off. So now when a student does that sort of thing with me, I remind myself of what I was like, and I find myself less upset as a result. You know?
Yeah, well, so one thing that just sort of stood out then, one of the things you said was this idea of someone making you angry.
Oh yeah, yeah,
And it's sort of it's a popular thing at the moment with it's all sort of Eastern philosophy and Buddhism and things like that. And
yeah,
a common retort to that would be that the other person doesn't make you angry. You allow yourself to become angry due to the circumstances.
yeah.
And
And that's partly true, you know.
really, I'm not sure how much I buy into that. I think you've just at a at sort of a theoretical level, it sort of works. It's similar that it's tied to that philosophical idea of I don't know who it was who said this, and I'll probably misquote it. It's something like there's no such thing as bad or good, but thinking makes it so.
Oh yeah, that Shakespeare quote. Yeah, and that
Is that
gets
Shakespeare?
yeah, and
And I'm
what the
not
Stoics
I'm
say.
not convinced. I'm
Yeah,
not convinced by that. I think that we are sort of it's in the same way that we've got this sort of this idea of Cartesian duality.
hmm
It's the separation of mind and body. I think there's a similar mistake being made there, a sort of a Cartesian duality, if you like, between the 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 embodied person and the world out there, and forgetting that we're wedded together.
yeah.
Do you
I
know
mean,
what I mean by that?
yeah, and I would say that it's so I think that the problem is thinking that it has to be either one way or the other entirely. So it's not just that there's this whole outside world and all that stuff is totally indifferent, and we could take it in any way that we wish, and it's our fault for getting upset about that. There are some things that I think we should genuinely find upsetting, and there are some things that are kind of built into our frames as bodily creatures, Um, but you know, so there's that aspect, right? We are responsible for um we're not it's not just us. There's things that do come in from the outside. But we also do get to decide to some degree how we filter them and frame them. And it can be very helpful to look at them in different ways, right? So if we think about like what's something that really does tend to tick people off? Like I'm walking on the street and somebody comes up to me and has a bucket of water and just like throws the water on me and then says, "Ha ha ha!" Now you're all wet. And let's say they're filming me too, and they're like, "I'm going to put this on YouTube. It's my prank, and I'm going to make $1 million with this." Okay, well, I would probably get ticked off. I might even grab the person. Although, thankfully, at this point in time, I probably wouldn't hit them. I'd yell at them. Um, now, should I just say, well, it's entirely up to me how I take the experience? No, there's something wrong with that, right? But I do have some control over what I do with it. Do I stew about it later on? This is another problem for me actually, is like having conversations with myself long after the incident is over about, what a jerk
Yeah.
that person is and what I should say. Totally unproductive unless I'm planning on actually having a meeting with them where I'm going to air my grievances. It's not helping me. It's just making me more upset, and it's reinforcing that habit once again. So there's both sides to it. Um, you know, the Stoics sometimes get portrayed as if they're just about being this sage like figure who's calm all the time, nothing on the outside bothers them. But you talk to Massimo, and I'm sure he's very honest about his own state of mind at things. There are things that tick him off, and all of us that are working on these things are sort of in process, right? Where none of us are claiming that we've completely got it down pat, and neither did any of the classic Stoic teachers. Um, they were giving advice to people about how to make their lives less screwed up than they currently were. Um, that's kind of a long ramble to respond. Does that answer your question or not?
It does, and it's also it's prompted this question, which is what is the is there any way of sort of articulating where the line should be drawn between when's it okay to be angry and not? Let's sort of separate this out now, because anger is wedded to concepts like vengeance and violence to an extent, and we'll
Yeah.
get to that. But right now, I'm just curious about where we find where's the line in the sand where it's justified to just be angry
Yeah.
and when it's not.
Well, like I mentioned, the Stoics say that it's never good, and Seneca thinks that anything that you can accomplish with anger, you can accomplish by rightly thinking things out. He does actually admit that sometimes you need to appear angry, like when you're, trying to sentence a bad person for their crimes, and you're trying to, scare them a bit. You need to appear angry when you're doing that. So the Stoics are at one extreme. Aristotle, who's not actually at an extreme, but I think kind of in the middle, because there are other people. The other extreme would be like, hey, get angry all the time. It's a great thing to do. Aristotle's much more in the middle, saying, and he does say it's not easy to say when you should get angry, who you should be angry with, how angry you should get, how long you should be angry, these sorts of things. But he does say these are the criteria, and we want to have kind of a middle position on this. And we should also sort of mistrust our culture about it too, because very often we're getting signals about, well, it's okay for you to be angry with these people, but not with these people, and we should look at that rationally and say, well, why these people and not these people? Maybe I should get angry with all of them, or maybe I shouldn't get angry with any of them, or maybe there's some other criterion. But he sets out, so who are we getting angry with? We can ask ourselves that question, right? Are we getting angry with the person that actually caused something, or are we finding a more convenient target because we'd rather, as we say in comedy, right, kick downward to somebody who we have power over, rather than face the person who really hurt us or hurt other people that we care about. So the person, what we're getting angry about, there's some things that we probably shouldn't get angry about. If somebody cuts in front of me in the line in the grocery store, that's probably not worth getting upset about. If somebody cuts ahead of my kid in an application for going to college, maybe I should get angry about that, right? Um, how angry we get, there we can get angry about something, but not get so angry that we're punching people, or writing, trying to destroy them on social media or something like that. Um, how long we get angry for, whether we require revenge or not before we're satisfied. All of those are good criteria. Aristotle actually does think that there are some people on the other end who don't get angry when they should, and it could be because they just don't register it. He calls them spiritless, but it could be that they're the kind of people who just stuff it down too, right? And then it comes out through passive aggressive behavior. But he thinks that most of us are on the other end, where we get too angry too quickly, hold grudges, get bitter about things. So we don't have any one. There's no one single way to draw the line, but we do have, like, you could say, the components for drawing the line. And I think it's useful to talk with, like, a coach or a mentor, or sometimes just a friend, right? Hey, do you think I'm off base in how I reacted to this? You walk through the situation. That can Getting another person's take, I think, is often very helpful, because one of the problems with anger is that it tends to make us think that we're more right than we are. You know, somebody does something wrong to you, and then you get angry, you get into a argument with them, and you say a lot of terrible things to them, and you're like, well, they deserved it, they had it coming, and they're true anyway. They do stink, and they are ugly, and we tell ourselves, hey, that's okay. And if we had somebody else with us, they could say, oh, you really crossed some lines there, you need to fix that. you know so I you know if when we get better with anger, we can actually be that person ourselves. But I think quite often we need other people to not to put a fine point on it, to call us on our BS. I know I
Yeah, I
certainly
don't.
did.
I don't know if you've got any sort of speculations on this. This is more sort of a question in the realm of evolutionary psychology.
Okay.
But it's surely there must be some evolutionary advantage to anger. You know, there's a reason. There's a reason it
Yeah.
exists. And what I find especially interesting, well, I think I'm right about this, is that we're the only we seem to be the only species that get angry, or that where anger manifests in the same way. And I was trying to think of this, and you see aggressiveness in, well, in like dogs for instance, and
Hmm.
but it manifests much differently. The build up isn't the same. It's very momentary. You know, you can see two dogs can have the most vicious fight ever, and then as soon as it's over, and they sort of go back to being normal. Whereas with us, it sticks with us. It persists,
Yeah.
and I'm just wondering. I mean, there's plenty to dig into there, but just to get us started, I'm just wondering whether you've know anything about that, whether there is sort of an evolutionary advantage to becoming angry.
Well, it's so there's really two topics there, right? There's that question of, is there some sort of payoff in terms of, transmitting genes and that sort of thing to becoming angry? And I'd say yes, there is, but I'd also say that the core of that is something we do share in common with other animals. And then there's, let's call it the second question, which is really about what other capacities that we've developed through evolution do to shape how anger is for us. So if we look at the first, right, Aristotle talks about this. He says, when an animal is threatened, it's going to, if it's the right kind of animal, it'll attack. Um, and that, he says, is anger. It's thumos, the word that he uses in Greek. And he's actually considering this in terms of courage. He says that's not really courage. A mother dog defending her puppies, it's not really courageous. It's just kind of a hardwired instinct, right? And
Mm.
we human beings have that too. I mean, I remember, this is kind of an interesting story. When my daughter was born, she's the one that was born first. I was about 30 or 31 years old, and I remember, like holding her and all that. And I remember having this kind of pervasive feeling of aggressiveness towards other men. And I was already kind of an aggressive guy. But there's sort of like a suspiciousness. And even when she wasn't in the room, and I talked with some of the older guys who I knew, and I said, "Is there something wrong with me?" And they said, "Oh, no, no, I went through that too." And it was the guys who had a daughter as their firstborn kid. Now, I'm not saying this anecdotal thing proves anything, but there's something kind of interesting there phenomenologically, right?
Well,
This this
just to say, I can relate to that, Greg. So my first child was a little boy, Roman. He was born. He's 7 now, 7.5,
Yeah.
and it it was that cheesy sort of experience where I had my first kid, and it was like, oh my god, you would give your life for this
Yeah.
child, and
Yeah.
you love them in a way that's just completely alien to you. It's still sort of weird to think of now, but so we've just had our second child, well, a year ago, and she's a little girl,
Yeah.
and that the protectiveness that I feel is rabid in a way
Oh,
that it wasn't with Roman, and
yeah.
um I'm very much, I have that experience where I watch it, even the friendliest people
Yeah.
that she's interacting with. I'm watching them like a hawk, and I'm ready to twist your head off if
Yeah.
I feel like you're doing anything that threatens her in any way. And it sort of makes me feel bad in a way, because it's like, well, there's sort of an inherent sexism there, because
Yeah.
I wasn't
Yeah.
that way
Yeah.
with my little boy, and I'm still not that way with him. And I know I'm not gonna, and I know, as bad as it sounds, I know I'm gonna treat them differently when they're older. I'm gonna try not to, but there's something there with
Yeah.
that protectiveness. So
So,
I
I mean,
agree with you.
I think that So those sorts of experiences that we're talking about, that makes good sense. It jibes with evolutionary theory. And would there be some advantage into sort of a momentary state of aggressiveness, of being, we talk about the fight or flight response, right? So the fight response, you get adrenaline flooding through your body, blood moves away from the extremities, you're ready to duke it out with somebody. Sure, it would make sense, because if you didn't have that sort of thing, especially given that we're essentially predator creatures, right? Um, and we got the eyes in the front of our head. We do prey on other creatures, um, although we can also do the gathering as well. Um, it makes sense that we would have that. And I guess, once we get to having human bands running into each other, the ones that didn't have that response would presumably not pass their genes on. So there's that whole aspect. But then if you think about what else evolution gave us, um, those inheritances like tool making, or capacity for language, or higher thinking, anger, actually that makes anger much more dangerous. See, like, so you mentioned dogs, right? Dogs do sometimes hold grudges against other people. Keep pulling a dog's tail and having it turn around and bite you. And after a while, the dog is going to snarl when you come in the room. So you can say the dog is holding a grudge, but the dog can't talk about what a jerk you are,
But as
and,
well, Greg, I don't think it's not in the same way, is it?
yeah, yeah.
For the dog, it's more like it's that Pavlovian conditioning
Hmm.
where the dog isn't.
Yeah,
It's the behaviorist approach. So when the person comes in the room, the stimulus is there, the trauma is embodied in the room, and the dog
yeah,
knows to be wary of it. But the dog doesn't think about, as soon as the person leaves the room, the dog isn't still thinking about the person and holding a grudge in that same way.
yeah,
Whereas
exactly.
we,
Yeah.
yeah, we do, and that's what I'm thinking.
Well,
What's the advantage to that?
Well, there may not be an advantage. That's the thing, because evolutionary psychology is great at explaining what happens at the animal level. It's not very good, I think, at explaining what happens at the distinctively human level, in terms of evolutionary adaptation. It's good at saying, well, we have these capacities, and these were useful in some other way. So our big brains really useful for lots of stuff, but they can also trip us up, right? They open us up to the capacity of, say, imagining revenge, and dwelling on that. Our linguistic capacities allow us to communicate with others at a distance and have culture, and that culture then allows us to have all sorts of narratives in which we're the aggrieved party, and we should take revenge on these people who may not even know that they're the object of our anger. So it's less about what purpose anger serves, and more about how does anger hijack these functions that evolution gave us. You know, and that's it. Human anger is so much more dangerous than just purely animal anger, which is why we have to why we have to study it, and why we have to learn to. I'm not going to say master it. 'Cause I don't know that happens, but at least be able to deal with it.
So I was I don't. I'm terrible at articulating myself. So I didn't even graduate high school, me. So sometimes I've got these concepts floating around in my head, which sound like it's going to be a good question, but then when I speak it doesn't come out quite well. So you might have to try and translate my own question for me here into English to start off with before we even
Well, let me say
simplify.
though, I would have never have guessed until you told me that you hadn't been to college. So
Yeah, well, there might be evidence of that in a minute. So it's it's because so it's this idea that with anger sort of being tied up depths of vengeance
yeah,
and to justice to an extent. You want to that holding a grudge. I'm guessing is a sort of it's justice yet to be served, and I'm sort of wondering whether, again, this is going to be sort of purely speculative, but whether maybe the concept of justice is something that grew out of anger as emotions like anger and vengeance evolved, whether justice naturally followed from that, or whether there's anything in the idea that justice sort of existed out there in the universe in an abstract sense anyway,
Yeah.
that sort of imbalances in the interactions between beings on the planet, and that evolution caught up with that, so that there is necessarily such thing as justice
Yeah.
aside from just what we think about it. I don't know if that made any sense, or
No,
whether
no, that's actually very well put. And I myself agree with the second idea, but I think that it's very so. Aristotle says justice is an ambiguous term. This is in his Nicomachean Ethics, and what he means by that is, look, there's a lot of different senses of justice, and a lot of the arguments that we get in are because person A is using it in this sense and person B is using it in this sense, and they're talking past each other, and then they get ticked off at each other. Sometimes people think that what's just in one context is automatically just in another context, or because they're right in about one thing, that they're right across the board. And he highlights these problems, and this is a thing that a lot of moral theories do for us, but it still makes it quite difficult in application. I think that I don't think that justice itself came out of anger, but I think that you could say they flow in parallel tracks, right? And that's one reason why anger in human societies um, can be quite useful, at least on the surface, because it allows people to enact something that looks like justice. It might not be completely just, but when, like, we're going through elections right now, and there's kind of a let's throw the bums out sentiment, and people are angry about particular things. Maybe they have good reason to be angry about. Probably some of it's misdirected, but some justice will probably get done as a result. Um, so they're connected together. The problem with anger is that it often makes us more optimistic about our idea that we've sort of figured out what the just thing is. And the other problem too, Thomas Aquinas points this out. Um, Anger is a reaction against perceived injustice, and the way in which it thinks that it's making things right, setting up justice, is by doing something that in any other situation would be injustice to the other person. So if you and I are friends, right, and you don't show up on time to, I don't know, meet me for a beer after work, and I'm waiting and I'm waiting, and I'm getting ticked off, and you finally show up, and I'm like, okay, glad you're here. And I say it in a snotty kind of way. You buy me the beer for the rest of the night, right? And you're like, oh, okay. I'm really sorry about that. Now, me telling you that you should pay for all the drinks, that's not fair. That's not just. And in any other situation, like if you were there on time and I said, "Hey, glad you're here, you pay for all the drinks." You'd be like, "That's nonsense. Why should I do that?" Or pick any other thing. But because we're in that situation and it's going to somehow make things right, I get to do that to you, you know?
yeah, it's
Um,
it's
and
interesting.
then you can
It
say, "Hey, that's not fair," and we can go back and forth. You can get angry at me for getting angry at you. You know?
Yeah, it's that. I suppose that was one of the reasons why I was sort of interested in this idea of it, the evolutionary advantages of it, because it's this the one emotion where you just in in response to this your perceived injustice, you can sometimes
Yeah,
go completely overboard.
yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
it. So I mean, a common example would be, it's sort of like the beginnings of a joke. This, but someone spills someone's beer in a pub, and then the next minute they're
or you
getting
punch
the
them.
red.
Yeah,
They're getting their head smashed in on a pavement, or
yeah,
sometimes to the extent that people end up being killed or brain damaged over a beer being spilled, or someone perceiving you were looking at my girlfriend, that sort of thing.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think in situations like that, so there's two things going on. There's like the biological level of once we do get angry. Now, we don't look to Aristotle anymore for, like, scientific discussions of how the human body works. But he said anger is a boiling of blood around the heart, right? And metaphorically, I think that's kind of true. We tend to feel anger here in the chest, and or we talk about seeing red. We have all these metaphors for it. What's going on? Once we become angry, our bodies are kind of taking over. So there's that level, and then there's like the cognitive level, where we're telling ourselves that what we're doing is perfectly rational, justified, as we're pounding somebody to a pulp, or tearing them down in social media, or humiliating them, and like say in front of their coworkers. We're telling ourselves momentarily that that's okay. And then, if we start to realize that, we're posed with a difficult choice. Do we actually say, "Holy crap, what did I do? This is wrong." That's tough to do. Some people will just rather stay angry and keep repeating the same things, instead of feeling regret and deciding to somehow remedy the situation. And sometimes there's nothing we can do. If you, for example, let's say you think that your girlfriend is cheating on you, so you're like, "Oh, fine, I'm going to get on Tinder and cheat on her. I'll show her," and you cheat on her, and then you throw it in her face. If you realize afterwards that you did such a stupid thing, you're probably not going to get a second chance. And even if you do, she's going to keep a watchful eye on you after that. Or you can pick any sort of thing like that. There's many, as we say, you can't unring a bell, right? um
It is. It's very that sort of, people talk about seeing red, and
yeah, yeah,
it's sort of how short sighted it is. That's the thing that I find really sort of fascinating about it, is that in any other situation, in any other context, social situation, you've got the weight of the world, the weight of society, and all its laws and customs and consequences sort of bearing down on you, and steering you in a certain way, and influencing the way you act and
yeah.
behave. But when you're angry, you can
You
none
can break
of that
free of it.
matters.
Yeah, yeah,
None of it matters. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that what you're about to do is socially unacceptable. It doesn't matter that what you're about to do could land you in prison for 25 years. It could destroy your family. It
yeah.
could completely destroy your future. It doesn't matter to you. What matters in that moment is
Getting that
enacting.
revenge. Yeah.
Yeah, is getting the revenge, and to hell with everything else. And it's
Yeah, it elevates that into like the primary good that outweighs all the other goods. And so it represents a sort of wrong prioritization, you could say, right? We lose sense of our other priorities. This is why, again, having a friend who can say, "Hey, do you really want to do that? Think about what these consequences are. Think about the thing that you're losing." In the action movies, we always see we always see the buddy saying, "Don't fight him. It's not worth it." Right? And that's a good friend. They never listen to him.
one of the other things I've just sort of anecdotally, that I've noticed about anger in guys that are, you've sort of got two guys that are facing off in
Mhm.
outside a bar or whatever, and they are the steaming, the red in the face, they're like two pit bulls. And like we were just saying then, the all the conventions of society and the law and everything go out the window. But interestingly, one thing that can stop guys when they are in that mode is women. In the sense that women civilize men in a general sense. They make you clean up your act, and you want to like be a better person for them.
Yeah.
It's always interesting that you can have two guys who were both 6'5", like 250, 300 pounds, about to go at it, and nobody can stop them. But if their two girlfriends get in between them, they can calm a situation. I've always found that really, really fascinating. That the
Sometimes,
power that
sometimes they'll actually go way too far and punch one of them. Um, but you're right. There's definitely. I mean, there's other things. Some people are reasonable enough to be scared when they see a policeman coming by. Um, but it all depends on how deep anger gets its hooks into you, I suppose. Some people are more. Some people are still ticked off, but they're more or less amenable to suggestions. Others, you know, look out.
One of the sort of interesting things I was reading a bit about was the distinction made between how some people's anger manifests as self-destruction, whereas
Oh,
other
yeah.
people's anger manifests as aggression to the outside world. And I was wondering whether that, like we, saying it's very much tied to this idea of vengeance and justice. I was
Mhm.
wondering whether that does that tend to be the people that take it out on themselves. I'm guessing the tendency there is because maybe they haven't got the power. They are people that don't tend to have the power to enact the vengeance that they
Yeah.
wish for. Do you think there's something in that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I would say there's really 3 uh, modalities there, right? So there's like the I'm gonna get angry and I'm actually allowed to be angry, show anger, act on anger, right? And then there's the I get angry and I'm not allowed to show it, or I'm allowed to show it, but I'm not allowed to act on it. And so it gets driven within, and it can take all sorts of forms, you know. And then there's a third form that Nietzsche calls resentiment, and here is where somebody really wants to get revenge on somebody else, and they're powerless to do so. Like, think about working in an office where the boss is a total jerk to you, but you have to hold on to that job because there's no other jobs, you know. And so you suck it up day after day after day. And you can say that it does get directed on yourself, but it also gets directed onto the other person. But it gets directed onto them in ways that can't be identified as getting revenge or anger. And so it turns into, passive aggressivity, or into always trying to tear things down. And it can affect not just the original um, aggressors, let's call them, but it starts to pervade your entire life. So, these sour people who anything that's raised up, they always got to tear it down. Nietzsche would say that they're probably filled with what he calls resentment, and it comes through this complex of not being able to not necessarily even attain revenge, but not even being able to entertain revenge, not being told. This is where, like, certain forms of morality can actually be harmful for a person. If you tell some kid, well, the Christian thing to do is to always, always, always turn the other cheek, forgetting the fact that the scripture doesn't actually say turn the other cheek infinitely. It just says, hey, do it once, and then it kind of leaves it up to us to figure out what we ought to do. And you stress this over and over again. That's a recipe for producing somebody who's filled with resentment. And it could be, turned against others in that way, or it could just be driven within. So, some people develop eating disorders on that sort of basis. Other people engage in various risky behavior. There's all sorts of things that this can lead to. And I'm not saying that everyone should go out and like indulge themselves in their anger, but there is something very helpful about, like, say, bringing it to the surface and getting to talk about what you're angry about. Um, that's often what psychotherapy has to do.
Do you think that maybe that's got something? I mean, it's sort of a sensitive subject at the moment, but maybe that's sort of ties up with with like school shootings and things like that. Is
Mm.
um, I mean, not necessarily with well, I won't pick out individual instances actually, but just
Yeah,
this, the idea that you've got someone who otherwise wouldn't be able to enact any sort of revenge
yeah,
for whatever, whether it's their life circumstances that are making them angry, or whether they're being bullied at school or whatever, and then their anger reaches a certain point that obtaining these guns.
yeah.
And I've got to say, I'm speaking now as somebody that if I lived in America, I think I'd be a pro Second Amendment guy, to be honest.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah. And but it's in that situation, the person then has got this sort of pent up anger and a sense of vengeance. But now they've also got the means by which
right.
to enact that vengeance.
Yeah, and usually what they've been doing profiling of these shooters, and there's a consistent profile developing. They have some sort of grievance. It's how they're framing the grievance, and they have a sense of entitlement as well in a lot of the things. And then we have this crazy easy access to guns, even in places like the pro gun people are always like, well, what about Chicago? Well, Chicago's full of guns because they come across from Indiana where they're easy to get, or from other parts of Illinois. So even where we do have good laws in place, they're subverted. This is actually an issue that myself in recent months I've become very angry about, but on the other side, because I think about the fact that my children live in a red state with their mother, where access to guns is super easy, and they're not actually worried. I asked them about this, about getting shot in school, but they probably should be. And all it takes is one person who, because we don't do very good mental health over here too. It's like a patchwork to get access to the guns that we have everywhere. And there's no way I can protect them against that. And I think that's part of what's been going on just recently in our politics. We just had a big election here in Wisconsin, which is a swing state, and the Republicans lost pretty effectively, and it's largely over the gun issue, you know, because people like me, veterans who say, well, why is it okay for I know what military grade rifles do because I shot them. I don't want civilians having access to them. So why the hell do they? And you say, well, because the legislature passed these laws. That's fine. We'll vote them out. I'm a centrist, and I'm voting with the left on these sorts of things. And I think we're going to see a lot of that. In part because the other side is being so unreasonable. All it would take is passing some sort of universal legislation that the NRA would hate, but that would require the Republicans to sort of get themselves off of that, which would be very good for them. Um, and I similarly get very upset about the Democrats and their dependence on their lobbies and things like that. But that's something. And there's many other veterans. There's an entire movement, Veterans for Gun Reform, where people are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and saying, I got shot at over there so that I don't have to get shot at over here in a movie theater, or my kids get shot at in a school. Let's actually do something about this. And there's an example where anger can be a good motivating force, I think. Um, so yeah, I have a very different position on these matters, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that's worth considering as well for people on this subject is, and I interviewed a guy called DJ Jaffe on mental illness policy in the US, and one of the biggest sort of injustices that's going on at the moment with this particular issue is the denial of the link between violence and
Yeah,
untreated mental health issues.
yeah,
Sort of, mental health campaigners always bring up the idea of stigma, and linking mental illness with violence
yeah,
is stigmatizing,
yeah,
and that's fine. But the statistics show, and DJ points this out quite starkly in his book, that there is a definite link between violence and untreated mental
yeah,
illness. But let's
yeah.
let's not go down the yeah, let's not go down this
Well,
road
let me
because
say one
oh, go
let
on.
me say one thing about that though for your viewers, because I know that you've got people from all over the place. I think one of the things people don't understand about the United States is we don't have a system. As opposed to most countries where there is some sort of national system, we have a whole patchwork of state and then local institutions, and they can be completely different from one place to the other. And then veterans, of course, are treated by Veterans Affairs, and one Veterans Affair hospital can be excellent. The other one, just down the road, can be terrible. So there, the quality of care that we get is incredibly varied, and so many people fall through the cracks. And I think a lot of people outside of America, they have the assumption that like we've got one big system and it's not a very good system. We have some places that are just superb, and then the next state over it might be terrible. So yeah,
Yeah,
so
I mean, yeah, the other part of it is the whole the deinstitutionalization movement,
oh
so,
yeah,
and all that happened there was people, again, you just need to read DJ's book on this. The amount of people that were institutionalized has just shifted over to the prison system.
yeah,
So it looks like, even though the people that were institutionalized, even though the statistics have plummeted, and it looks like everything's getting better, on the flip side
yeah,
of it,
yeah.
the amount of people that are wound up in prison is just going up and up. So yeah, there's that as
And
well.
the prison thing is the same thing. We don't have a system. We have 50 states, each of which has its own DOC, and then we have all these counties. Some county systems are larger than some state systems, and the quality of care that you might get is incredibly varied. There are some places where I know I could do time and I'd be okay, and there's other places where I'm like, that's a hellhole. I hope nobody has to go there. You know?
Well, Greg, from one controversial topic to another.
Yeah,
So this is just something that it only occurred to me today. Well, in the past couple of hours, just before we were due to sit down. Um, so, oh God, I mean, this interview might not even go out based on this. So you'll be pleased to know, Greg, that
yeah,
this interview should be going out the Saturday after next, and you'll be following straight on from an interview that I've conducted with a guy who is a self-confessed paedophile.
oh,
And not only that, he's somebody who advocates for making, lowering the age of consent to, well, I think he was involved in an organization that lowered it to lower it to 6 or 4 or something like that.
oh wow,
And he's very open about it. We had a long conversation, 3 hours. It was it's me taking this podcast to the next level in terms of the subjects that I'm willing to talk about. But the way that ties into this conversation is, um, besides sort of anticipating anger from people
yeah,
on my behalf for merely conducting this conversation in the first place, what's interesting about that particular concept is we're talking about how anger tends to arise at this idea of perceived injustice.
yeah,
And what's interesting is that's one topic where if you get somebody who has that proclivity, and even if they haven't offended, even if it's not non-offending pedophiles or something like
yeah,
that,
yeah.
people don't give a shit. That it's just the mere mention of it makes people angry. And I'm just wondering what your take on that is, and maybe not that topic specifically, but just this idea that in some instances it's only the mere potential for an injustice to take
Yeah,
place
exactly,
is enough to
exactly.
make someone angry. And I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on that.
You know, I Aristotle makes a distinction between anger and hatred, and he says that anger wants to inflict some sort of penalty and response on the person. Hatred wants the person literally not to exist. And he says that hatred can be felt against entire classes of people. He uses thieves as an example. Uh, People who steal things, we should get rid of all of them. And I think when we're talking about pedophiles, there are a lot of people who just it's part of their sort of mental framework. They're always bad. There's nothing redeemable about them. They should all be put on an island or killed off or something like that. And it's interesting here in America we have these laws that in some respects confine anybody who's on the sex offender registry to a ghettoized existence because of that. They can't approach within 500 feet or sometimes 1,000 feet of all these different places where children are. So I think in some respect it would be more like hatred than anger. But when we have anything like that in play, it becomes much easier for us to feel anger. So if I already think that somebody doesn't have a right to be the way they are or even to exist, then if they do anything, I can very easily become angry at them, you know. Or again, transferring it on to you. You shouldn't even host an interview with this guy. What are you doing offering him a platform? So they can hate him and be angry at you as a result.
Do you? I'm just.
And I'm not saying it's rational, but
Yeah, I'm wondering whether that I'm not quite sure how to articulate, but I'm not sure that distinction quite works for me. The distinction between hatred and anger. I mean, you've quoted Aristotle as saying that. Do you agree with that
well,
idea, that separation?
I think it's more. I think we don't want it to be a rigid separation. I think we want to acknowledge that there could be like blending of one into the other. Augustine actually talks about this, and he says one of the reasons why anger is so dangerous, although it can serve some purposes, if you indulge it for a long time, it turns into hatred. So it's not as if there's a line here, and either it's this or it's this. You could be feeling both at the same time, or one can blend into the other. Seneca also talks about the tendency for anger to go into a different issue, which is cruelty, where when you're angry, right? You're a jerk to me. I want to hurt you, right? If you go on long enough like that, I can like to just hurt you just for the sake of hurting you, and then I can come up with occasions, for doing so. So I think that these distinctions are useful because they help to bring out different aspects, right, of how we relate to each other and what's going on in our heads. But we don't want to say, well, there's an essence that's hatred and an essence that's anger, and either I have one or the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, yeah, I guess I'm getting a little bit caught up in like you're saying, those sort of hardline separations between
Yeah, yeah.
concepts. Yeah, another one is the idea of like violence being tied up with anger. And I was thinking of this in the sense of the way like atrocities in war and things like that.
Hmm.
And but then another one I was thinking of was um, quite an interesting one. Is like the job of the executioner. So
Hmm.
when somebody that's let's sort of take it back to the medieval times when that was like a full-time job. I mean, I don't know if it
Yeah.
was. I might have just got that from Hollywood, but I'm guessing someone was sort of a designated executioner, and um, I imagine that you'd you'd have to be angry to sort of do that sort of thing. Whereas
I don't think so.
no,
I mean, no, I mean, it's possible I mean, people kill each other over other sorts of motivations. Greed, for example, business partners, do each other in, and they're not angry at each other. They just want to control the entire business. And so, if you're an executioner and it's your job, it's not a job I think a lot of people would want, myself included. But you could start just looking at it. Well, this is my job, and make sure my axe is very sharp and I do it right the first time, so there's no embarrassment. Seneca again talks about. He says one of the reasons we don't need anger is because everything that you can do through anger, you can do better through following proper practical reason. So if you should be out there on the battlefield, charging the enemy, you don't have to be angry to do that. As a matter of fact, being angry might be an impediment because it tends to make you, a bit tunnel visioned, right? It might be better just to be out there calm, shooting people away. Like we had a hero in the First World War, Sergeant York, um, and he did that. He the American troops were pinned down by Germans, and he just stood there, just shooting away at them. And these were rifles where he had to cock it again, and he'd shoot another one. And he shot like 27 guys, I think, and the Germans couldn't hit him. And they ended up retreating because they're like, well, we can't kill this guy, and he keeps killing us. Now he wasn't angry. He who knows what the hell was going on in his head. He might have, for all we know, he may have been a sociopath. Although I'm not suggesting that he necessarily was, but he wasn't motivated by anger. As a matter of fact, if he was angry, he might have had a harder time cocking his rifle and aiming and calmly shooting.
yeah, it's sort of a common thing that's said about like martial arts and boxing is
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
you've
You get angry, you're placing yourself at risk of your opponent using that against you, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's like you say, it's that it brings about that loss of control. And
Yeah.
okay, so here's one that it's just popped into my mind now, and I'll ask you about it before it before it slips off into the ether. And so this is coming from a personal place, I guess, is the concept of being angry at yourself. And I think that's, for me, that was one of the, before it became pathological, before it turned into anxiety and agoraphobia and all the other things.
Yeah.
When I first lost my business, a very, very sort of very angry at myself. And I don't, I'm not sure how, when you are angry at yourself, if I'm pissed off at you over here, I can go give you a smack in the mouth. But
Yeah.
when you're angry at yourself, what do you do with that?
I mean, some people actually do physical things to themselves, like they'll, smack themselves in the face, or, they'll deprive themselves of something, or they'll exercise themselves very hard. Um, yeah, I mean, in a way, when you're angry at yourself, you're treating yourself as if you're an object for the subject that you are. Now, sometimes when you're angry at yourself, you might not really be angry at yourself for good reason, and it could be just somebody's told you to do that, right? And you've kind of internalized somebody else's values. But if you genuinely are angry at yourself, like, you know, I I mean, I think of some of the things that I've said and done, and I could get angry with myself, either because I did things that are bad for myself, or because I did things that are bad for other people, and I don't want to be that sort of guy. Um, Now, what do you do with that? I mean, at a certain point, you can get over it, but that requires forgiving yourself, right? And maybe sometimes you shouldn't. I think some people are too forgiving of their own problems. They let themselves off too easily. Interestingly, there is one guy who I sometimes bring up when I'm talking about, like the history of anger, John Cassian. And if you think the Stoics are like, you know, zero tolerance with anger, John Cassian was even more. He was a monk, and he's going out and visiting these desert fathers, and anger was a big problem for them too, because, they said, listen, if you're an angry person, you go out in the desert because you think, well, I'm not going to punch anybody out here. You're going to get angry at the wind and the sun and your sleeping mat and your writing instruments and stuff like that. And he said, the only person who you should get angry with is yourself. That's the only time that getting angry is actually helpful. And I don't agree with him on that, but he does represent a certain point of view. Um, and so, it can be productive sometimes to be angry with ourselves if it motivates us to change our mindsets or behavior, or to, start modifying our habits. But then at a certain point, we have to stop being angry with ourselves, right? I mean, if you were just carrying it around all the time, I think that would be bad for you.
Yeah, I think there's that sort of interesting distinction between acute anger and then chronic anger.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So you've got, acute anger is that it's that very momentary, and it's sort of fleeting to an extent.
Yeah.
But chronic anger is, I find I find that interesting because I always sort of conceptualized anger as having the sort of narrative that it did for me, where after a while it becomes exhausting, and it turns into something else.
Mm,
It turns into depression, or it turns into anxiety. It sort of
yeah.
manifests differently. But then
Yeah.
you do meet people that just seem to be just angry all
Yeah.
the time.
Yeah.
And yeah, again, have you got any sort of yeah? It's
Well,
maybe
this
a
was
personality thing, but what separates what enables some people to keep that shit up for years?
yeah. I mean, that's what the ancients called habit. You act in a certain way over and over again. You become that way. And I think that, so there's like habit formation, which ties in with how you feel, how you act, what you think about things. And then there's also narratives, the stories that we tell ourselves. And so we can become sort of caught in a story where we're going to become angry people. And then there's the structure of our relationships. You know, you see these people who have the same failing relationship romantically over and over and over again. You know, and what's the common element in that? Them, right? They keep choosing the
Mm.
same relationship. We can do that with things like people who are chronically angry often, just it's not coincidental. They seem to have relationships that tick them off, you know? And you wonder, well, why do you keep hanging out with those friends if they're constantly ticking you off? Can't you find people who don't? And maybe they're so badly off that they get mad at everybody. But probably they can find some people who do that less often. And they kind of gravitate to choosing those sort of situations, or choosing the kind of job where they're going to be ticked off. If you don't like, say, dealing with people because you don't like people yelling at you, then don't go work in a rock and roll arena and sell peanuts or anything like that, right? you know uh, if you don't like, people getting your car dirty, don't be an Uber driver, because you're just kind of setting yourself up for that. And so the chronic thing is often a complex. It's not just one thing. It'll be habit, that entire complex there, mindset, narrative, and relationships.
Do you think, for you, with anger being a problem, do you think it's a case of the anger, the anger always remains there, and it's just how you learn to deal with it? Or do you think you can actually sort of dial the anger
Yeah,
down? And if so,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
how do you go about doing that?
So there's like three questions there. One is sort of like, is it the same anger, right? When I get angry at person A next week, Monday, is it the same anger that I felt last week, Tuesday, over something different? Or are these like, individual instances that just happen to look the same? So that's one interesting question. Um, and then does it get better? Yeah, it does. I can say from my own experience, but when you're doing the work for it, it sure doesn't feel like it is. You only notice it after a while, and you notice it with little victories where you're like, well, I didn't get as angry that time, right? I said, four things to that person, whereas normally I might have ripped into them for a while. Or it might be a negative thing where you're like, oh wow, I'm not thinking about what a jerk that person is and what I should have said to them the way I used to in the past. And so, what can you do? I mean, the short answer is there's a lot of different techniques and strategies, and you might say tricks, in some sense, that come to us from a couple different sources. One is ancient moral theory. So, Aristotle had some useful stuff. The Stoics had some useful stuff. Plutarch wrote an entire book on how to deal with anger, because this was a big problem for them at that time. Um, and then there's like you could say a theological tradition as well, that often was based in spiritual direction, where you'd have a mentor and they'd be looking at you and saying, wow, you're really badly off, let me see if I can help you. And then modern psychotherapy, I think, offers some useful stuff. Sometimes that's actually taken from the ancient philosophers, though, like the cognitive behavior therapy stuff, that's all there in the Stoics for the most part. And so when you bring these together, you get like a whole toolbox that can be useful. And then accountability and sort of like keeping track of it is helpful. And I think if it's the right kind of group, because you don't want to be in a like a group therapy thing where people are just sharing their problems and bitching about stuff and kind of reinforcing their own bad tendencies, right? But if you can have the right kind of group where they're genuinely trying to work on their stuff, it's really helpful to compare with other people, so you don't feel like you're the only person who's struggling with that. I have so many clients where the most helpful thing that I have to say to them is, that's a common problem, you know, because oftentimes we feel like whatever we're struggling with, we're not the only person in the world, but the other person probably lives, in the next county over or something like that.
Yeah, it is. That is a common. It's a common thought in people with mental health issues is that it's either I'm the only person in the world that's dealing with this, or like you say,
Yeah.
if I'm not, the people that are dealing with it are few and far between. And the thought that goes along with that is, even if there are other people dealing with it, they deal with it better than I do. And
Yeah.
even if there
Yeah.
is other people dealing with it, their problem probably isn't as complex or as difficult as my problem is. That's
Yeah.
yeah, that's
You're right.
definitely
You're
true.
totally right about that. Yeah.
Um, just just out of interest, because you sort of specialize in stoicism as well. I'm wondering if there's any sort of stoic exercises that are actually designed to test you when it comes to anger. I know these ones like with poverty and things like that, purposefully sort of
Yeah.
sleeping on the floor and eating like just rice and beans and stuff to sort of give yourself a taste of what it'd be like to live in poverty, just to teach yourself that you could actually deal with this even if it did come about. And just because, Greg, people always love a list of exercises at the end of a podcast that they like to think that they're going to go off and try, but they can never be asked doing. But if if you've got any
Yeah.
anyway, I'd like to hear them.
Well, Epictetus has this great sort of reframing thing. He's got a couple chapters about anger in his discourses, and he says that when somebody does something that we don't like and we're getting angry with them, we can remind ourselves that the reason why the person is doing that is because on some level, it seems like the right thing or the rational thing for them to do. And you can say, and now I'm going to be totally paraphrasing this. This is not what Epictetus himself says, but we can say, "Oh, you poor bastard," uh, you're stuck in this loop where you actually think that insulting me or taking my parking space is or whatever it is that's ticking us off is the right thing and rational thing for you to do. And you could say, well, wait, what about people who are bullies? They know they're doing the wrong thing. You say, yeah, but on that higher level, they think being a bully is the cool thing to do. That's what they ought to be doing. And you can say, wow, you poor bastard. And if you do that, and you don't do it in kind of a patronizing way. I mean, don't tell them, oh, I'm being a stoic and not letting you get to me. Don't do anything remotely like that. But if you say that to yourself, you can find yourself not being as affected by it. It takes a while to do it, but so that's one thing.
Well, let me just add something to that, Greg, and just from personal experience, just to sort of back that up. So, what was it? Up until like September last year, I was running a mental health support group, and it was sort of it was my job to sort of go around and speak to people and engage in conversations, initiate conversations, introduce people to one another, and to try and to be a host to a certain
Yeah.
extent. But people would mistake my role as the host as someone to sort of welcome them into the fold. They thought it was my job to make sure that they had a good experience, that they interacted with
Oh,
other people. It wasn't a formal, we didn't sit right, it wasn't like a sort of Alcoholics Anonymous setup where we all sat
yeah,
in a
yeah.
circle. It was just a social environment. Everyone's in the same boat and you get to sort of blow off a bit of steam together and relate to one another. And people would feel that it was my responsibility. So if they had a bad experience, it was my fault. And what I would get quite commonly was the keyboard warrior thing had happened. So someone had come to the event. They'd have a bad experience or feel like they struggled to speak to people, so they felt embarrassed. And then people would email me and say, "Oh well, I was doing okay with my depression or whatever, and now because of you, I've been set back so many steps." And occasionally, people would name call. And I remember the first time I was really tested on it was, I would say, aside from the money thing making me angry, another thing that makes me angry is when if I feel that somebody speaks to me offside, if I feel someone speaks to me in a disrespectful way,
Yeah.
like we're having a load of family problems at the moment because my I'll not name anyone, but let's just say during Christmas, someone came to the family gathering and spoke to me offside, and I'm not having any of it. It was I don't care. I don't care that you were drunk. I don't care what your excuse is. You had one chance. Your one chance is over, and I
Yeah.
don't care about the consequences, the fallout of it, or how complicated the politics for the family have become. That's just my that's my. I've got to take a principled stance on it. Now, someone in an email, that group, they had a bad experience, and they called me a cunt in the
Wow.
email, and so my gut response was to send the most sort of demeaning, aggressive diatribe I could think of. It's like,
Yeah.
well, oh, you think I've upset you now? You think your depression's bad now? You just wait till you finish reading this email, motherfucker, because I'm really. But what I did was I did exactly
Yeah.
what you were just talking about then. But it wasn't an empty it wasn't an empty gesture. It wasn't just this vacuous sort of stoic exercise. It was, hang on a minute, right? When I was at my lowest, I never blamed anybody else. I was never aggressive to anybody else. It was never anybody else's fault. It was always my responsibility to of where I was at, and it was always my responsibility to fix it. And so I genuinely felt like, wow, if this person's in a place
Yeah.
where
They're worse off than you were. Yeah.
yeah, and but it was it. I really sort of internalized that and thought, wow, if you're in that place, you must be in an even darker spot than I was. And me just remembering how dark it
Yeah.
was for me, like I sort of empathize with you. And so
Yeah.
I instead I wrote an email back saying, well, pretty much that, and said, look, if you want to get together and we'll try and figure something out. Maybe we could meet up one on one, and we could have a chat, or just turn up next time, and I'll try and make the experience a bit better for you. But of course, I didn't receive a reply back, and it's because that I guess that person had let their anger get the better of them,
Yeah.
and to the extent that even though I responded positively, they felt there's no coming back from it now. Do you know what I mean? They've burned
Yeah.
their own
Oh,
bridges
yeah.
there
Yeah.
to an extent.
Yeah. You know, and that's another thing. Epictetus points out at one point. He says, "Listen, when somebody else is doing something to you that's making you angry, you think they're harming you, right? And so, what by getting angry and doing something to them and harming them, you're actually going to make things better. You know, you're probably going to hurt yourself in the process. And if you'd sent off that email afterwards, I'm sure you would have felt some regret and embarrassment and wish that emails had a take back
Yep.
function. Yeah. So that, I mean, that's another thing too. We could remind ourselves of that. Epictetus has another great thing he points out. Again, he points this out with respect to anger. When we allow ourselves to like lose control because of anger, we're not just doing something in that moment. We're either building or breaking a habit. And so, if we can remind ourselves that the stakes are more than just what's in the present situation. Now, if we're like already totally enraged, that's not going to help. But oftentimes, that can help us to get things back on track. You know, another thing too that I found useful and my clients have found useful is the what they call the premeditatio malorum, which just means like thinking about bad things before they happen, and not to be morbid, right? Not to like dwell on them, but to think, okay, I'm going into a situation like a meeting with somebody who I don't like. They usually try to provoke me. What's likely to happen, and then how will I deal with it? Because I do, and then you remind yourself, I do have the resources to deal with it. I don't have to let them push my buttons. I had a client who was actually, because I do some executive coaching, and he was like a CIO of a major corporation, and he wasn't the normal anger management kind of person who's like flying off the handle and chewing out their subordinates or anything like that. His only problem was he would go into meetings and they all kind of jockey with each other because they're all type A people, and he would find himself getting angry when questioned about his competence or the things that he was suggesting, and it would make him less able to communicate effectively. That was his whole issue. But he was operating at this very, very high level where that mattered a lot. And so we started doing the premeditatio malorum before he'd go into a meeting. And he found it was very helpful for him. So you know that you got to deal with some I don't know, somebody who you know is a pain in the ass, well, spend 5 minutes before that thinking about how you're going to get through that meeting without chewing them out. you know?
Yeah, I think another thing to consider, Greg, is probably like this, is probably maybe a shallow motivation, but I think there's something cool about witnessing that when, and maybe even being that when a situation's getting heated, and you've got someone who's just very, very stoic and immovable in their emotion, and they don't let their emotions
Yeah,
get the better of them, and they sort of well, if it's like in a debate sense or whatever. I mean, it's obviously wouldn't work if someone's sort of throwing punches, but
yeah,
when you're talking about heated debate, when somebody can very cool and calm and exacting in picking someone's arguments to pieces, which is much easier to do when someone's getting very emotive
right,
and
right,
they're not
yeah.
articulating themselves very well. I mean, I don't know if did you see did you see the interview between Jordan Peterson and Kathy Newman?
Oh, yeah,
From
yeah, yeah,
I mean, that was just, I think one of the reasons that went so viral was
yeah,
because that's a perfect example of one person being emotive and provoking the other person, and the way Jordan Peterson handled himself was just complete, just like a rock, just not
yeah,
being moved by it whatsoever, and just completely deconstructing and picking the other person to pieces in the calmest, coolest way. I
yeah,
mean, it was sublime to watch that. So again, I think that's a bit of a shallow motivation, but just to think if I can pull that off, it actually looks quite cool. Maybe it'll impress the ladies. I don't know. So
yeah.
okay, Greg, let's wrap this up. But as I do with everybody, I'm going to subject you to my quick fire questions.
Okay,
Um, so I'm going to add one, actually, add one before it's a new one. I'm going to test this out,
okay.
and it's the oh God, what's it called now? What's This is terrible. I'm gonna have to edit this bit out. What's the Mount Rushmore? There we go. I
Okay.
thought of it. It's your What would your Mount Rushmore of
Oh,
philosophers look like?
four people?
Yeah, it is four on Mount Rushmore. Let's go with three.
Oh, wow, that's even
I
tougher.
t- I t- well, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you why.
Okay.
I'll tell you why we'll go with three, because I'm sort of reminded of from Massimo Pigliucci's website. It's footnotes to Plato. So all of
Yeah,
philosophy is a footnote to Plato. So if we imagine that Plato's the given, he's number four or number one,
yeah.
whichever. Who are the other three?
Well, Aristotle would be one, and I think, Cicero, and then, Hannah Arendt.
And very quickly, why? And I know a lot of people might not be familiar with Hannah Arendt. So yeah,
Yeah.
just a little bit of why on each one.
Well, I mean, Aristotle is just absolutely central in my thought. I'm always working on him, and although there's certain things that we don't use him for anymore. There's When it comes to a lot of the psychology and moral theory, he's absolutely important. And then Cicero, I like he's an eclectic. He draws on the Stoics, he draws on Aristotle, he draws on the academic tradition. The only people he doesn't like is the Epicureans, and he's unfair to them. But he's got these really great sort of synthesizing perspectives, and I kind of model my own work after him. And then we're skipping over like thousands of years to Hannah Arendt. If I had to pick one person, I suppose from the present age, who I really like, not just for her work on totalitarianism and Eichmann in Jerusalem, but she goes back to people like Aristotle and Epictetus and Augustine, and she's trying to articulate how we can live together as rational creatures today in the modern era. And she's really brilliant. So
Okay, well, and following on from that, maybe it will, maybe it won't. But do you have any book recommendations? But it's either on this topic specifically, or just anything else
oh,
you
about
feel would be of value to the listeners.
anger. Seneca has a nice book called just on anger, and if you want to get the Stoic perspective, I think that's a great thing to do. Um, I did an interview a while back about like the three books that changed my life the most, and so I'll just include those in here as well because they all do discuss anger. Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and Epictetus's Discourses. Um, and yeah, I mean, I don't, there's a lot of works that treat anger, but I think those are really great starting points for people.
Okay. If you could take the reins of power at the Department of Health,
Oh,
what policy would you implement to improve the mental well-being of the general public?
assuming that we had a sort of functioning Department of Health here in the
Yeah,
United
well, I
States,
always,
right?
I always, I
Yeah,
always say just think dictatorially, so you can just do whatever you
yeah,
want.
yeah. Well, I would want to see like some sort of uniform access to mental health services. I would, I would want to see something like what we call single payer healthcare, which means like what you guys have over in Britain, um, with your uh, uh,
The
what is
NHS.
it? The NHS. Yeah, I was going to say NEH, and I knew that was an American thing. I think we have to have something like that eventually, and neither political party really seems to have the will to put it into place. But there's so many people suffering here because um, the plans that we have, they have so many loopholes, and people get screwed over. So yeah.
Okay. What, if anything, keeps you up at night?
Oh, very little. I tend to be asleep by midnight. But that's because I work so much. So the times that I do have insomnia, it's often worrying about my kids. Yeah, because I have so little control over you know what's going to ultimately be the case for them. Like how's my daughter going to do in college, or what if my son runs into this problem or that problem.
How old are your kids?
My daughter is 16 and my son is 10. He's going to be 11 very soon.
All right, so quite yeah. Well, mine are a lot longer, lot younger than yours. I find that I do worry about my kids, but that those aspects of it, I find quite exciting. My neuroses is worrying I'm going to die before I get to see those things.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I can relate to that. I do sit around worrying about my kids a lot. Yeah, they're a fucking pain in the ass in that aspect.
Yeah.
um,
Well,
okay,
they increase your vulnerability to the world immensely, right? Uh, that's one thing that kids do.
yeah, honestly, yeah, I don't think I sort of worried about the like the idea of like mortality and where my life was going to go and how things are going to end. I don't think I worried about that in the same way that as soon as my kids came along, those sort of the
Yep.
existential questions and dilemmas, they definitely came to the forefront. And it doesn't help that just knowing that it all ends in tragedy for us anyway. I mean,
Yeah.
just I mean, the idea that, we all die in the end. And it's like, well, that's fine. You lot are all going to die and I'm going to die. And I'm all right with that. But
Yeah.
looking at your kids and thinking that, oh, I don't know. That's
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
that's the toughest bit. Oh God, we're going right like a right morbid rabbit hole here. Let's pop our heads back up.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, here's a good one. You're gonna have to give us something really positive here, Greg. What's the best piece of life advice anyone's ever given you?
Oh, well, it's not positive I think to many people, but act like an asshole, get treated like an asshole. That's exactly what I needed to hear when I was young. And it was from somebody who just, was reacting in the way that you're talking about. They were very calm with me. I was being a jerk. This is when I was actually a ward of the court and I was in this juvenile detention center. I was acting like a tough guy. And this guy just said that to me. And suddenly all these things clicked into place for me. And I was like, oh yeah, I don't have to act like that. And it was so helpful. I mean, for me, it was very positive. Um,
Okay, what mistakes do you continue to make despite knowing better?
oh, letting smaller things get to me, and then not sort of immediately putting them into the proper perspective as the low priorities that they are, and taking them too much to heart, and then getting angry.
Have you got a what's your Achilles heel?
I've got more than one. um, I would say that one of the biggest things for me is reciprocity. If somebody, and consistency, if somebody treats me in a way that they don't like being treated themselves, and they've insisted on it, that really sets me off.
Mm. Okay, final three. What
Okay.
part of your career are you most proud of?
Oh, pretty much what I'm doing right now. Um, I had a very promising academic career, and I left it behind in part to no longer be stuck in a long distance relationship, and live in the same place as my then fiance. So I left behind, a job where I was up for early tenure, and I started this entrepreneurial thing, and I like what I do, and I certainly accomplish a lot more than I did as a professor.
Yeah, it's a ballsy move that as well. Like you say, you if you're up for tenure,
Yeah,
what prompted that?
love, you know. We did the long distance relationship thing for a year and a half, and that was, I only get to see her once a month, and that involved, so much travel. So we wanted to be in the same place.
That's a brilliant answer. See, we brought the tone back up. Perfect. Okay, final two. Outside of family and academia, what investment of time or money has brought you the most joy or fulfillment?
Say that last part one more time. You got a little bit garbled.
So, outside of family and academia, because they're the easy ones. Everyone resorts to them. So, outside of
Yeah.
family and academia or career, not allowed career either. What
Okay.
investment? What investment of time or money has brought you the most joy or fulfillment?
Oh, music. Um, I'm a big metalhead, and we actually just went to a show last night here in town, and saw Saxon and Judas Priest, and Black Star Rider. My wife and I both like that, and I passed my bass down to my daughter, and she plays and sings now.
Okay, well, for someone that's like, oh, metal, not into that. What's a good album to change people's minds and introduce them to metal?
Hmm. Um, that's a tough one. There was this compilation that I really enjoyed when I was a kid, and I think I don't know if you can get it anymore. It was called Metal Killers Collection. It was, kind of crazy stuff. It was Killers with a K, Collection with a K.
Yeah.
It had all the best bands at the time, and so that's a nice, sample selection. I'm sure somebody's put together something like that, with all those bands and songs.
Right. Okay. Well, I might try and dig that up, see whether it's going on Amazon or something, and then yeah, maybe people can check it out.
Okay.
Okay, the final one, the big one. What do you think is the key to happiness?
Oh. Uh I don't know, because I see it as like a whole bunch of different things connected together, but I would say probably the most important thing is, the relationships that you have, you know, uh, making sure that those are actually good, and understanding, of course, that, like you pointed out, we're all going to die. So most of the relationships, you'll either die before them, they'll die before you, or you'll die at the same time. But making them, really good while you've got them.
Okay, Greg Sadler, thank you very much. Have you got any links you'd like to direct the listeners, the viewers towards? Any websites, books? This is your chance to plug away and make this make this all worthwhile. Hopefully.
Sure. Yeah. People who want to support the work that I do, sort of the pro bono public stuff, can go to patreon.com/Sadler, and become, supporters that way. My YouTube channel, of course, just Google Gregory B. Sadler, and it'll come straight up. And then if people are interested in tutorials or philosophical counseling and coaching, that sort of business, they can go to ReasonIO.com, and that's my company website. I think that's pretty much. I mean, you can find me on Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that if you're into those sorts of things, you know. And again, it's just Google Gregory B. Sadler. There's only one of us out there, so.
Okay, perfect. Well, I will include, as usual, we'll include all those links in the show notes. So, in the meantime, Greg Sadler, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me on. This was a great conversation.